I'm super nervous, actually. I know I've been up and down off the stage all day, but I'm really nervous. And I just got the best feedback from Jen Forsland in the back. And what she said was, you wouldn't be feeling this way if you didn't care. And you know what? That's so true. It's just so true. So today I'm here to speak to you about something that I really care about and that is so very close to my heart. Now, what I do actually is I am a recovery coach. And I've been sponsoring, mentoring, and coaching women for primarily women for about 20 years now. Now, there's probably some therapists and some counselors in here who are rolling their eyes at the idea of a recovery coach. And so I should probably explain that recovery coaching it's not about therapy. We're not treating any pathologies, and we're not delving into people's past or reliving any traumas. That's just not what we do. And we're not counselors either. We don't tell people what to do. And we're not glorified 12-step sponsors. We're just not. We don't outline any one program for people to follow. So I've had all this feedback. I'd like to assure you that recovery coaching just isn't about that at all. But what recovery coaching is about it's about strength-based inquiry. It's about improving people's overall health and wellness through the kind of solution-based action plans that help them live more self-directed life. And in that way, it improves their overall health and well-being just through inquiry and having a conscious plan around recovery. So my why is fairly simple. I grew up in a situation that had a lot of trauma in it, and by 21 years of age, I was fully addicted to both drugs and alcohol. I had lived on the streets, I had been homeless, I'd been in and out of foster care, and I was really a wreck. And I found myself on a bridge ready to toss myself in because the drugs and alcohol just weren't working anymore. And so I've needed this kind of help. And so I was lucky enough, I came off of that bridge and I came into recovery at 21 years of age. And now I'm 23 years sober. And I'm 44 years old. Now, interestingly enough, that I'm considered one of the lucky ones because I've made it this far. And I was told by a counselor that the vast majority of people like me die on the downtown east side. And it's just a combination of effects that had her say that to me. But the truth is that recovery journey has not been anywhere near easy. I was just a couple weeks into recovery at 21 years old, and I was preyed upon by 4 men in the recovery rooms, sexual predators in recovery rooms. And I almost quit, and I almost went back to the bridge. But I was lucky enough to have women who backed me up and pulled me back and said, come on, girl, don't quit. Don't let those guys take that away from you, right? So I came back. And honestly, that first year was terrible. I was physically threatened by a sponsor, and I went 16 years in recovery programs with untreated PTSD, and then ended up affecting my family in quite a terrible way, actually. And so as I was going through recovery, I didn't get the help I needed. I got some of the help I needed, but I didn't get the whole spectrum of help that I needed. And so, and that help just really wasn't available to me. I couldn't find it. I did seek counsel. I did seek all of those things, but there wasn't someone who was educated on addiction, who was educated on recovery processes, who could help me source out the help that I needed. And much like Tracy just said, nobody was listening. They all sort of had the answers. They were all very good at telling me, you know what, just follow these steps, do this thing, shut up and listen, right? And I did those things. I was young and I was nervous and I was willing to listen and I was willing to try. And I followed what they said. And it took me almost like 1.5 years to realize that I didn't have to hug the creepy guy at the 12-step meetings, right? Who was like really gross. And I didn't have a mentor or a coach who could explain these things to me and help me navigate what can sometimes be a really, really complex system. The other reason I chose to take up this vocation, and I did it voluntarily for a lot of years. I mentored women voluntarily through my company. I mentored women voluntarily through sponsorship. I mentored women voluntarily and young youth voluntarily through a program called Wired for Success. But I've decided to make it my career now and get more education about it, because I've seen that, addiction is becoming more and more of an epidemic. We hear about more and more people falling through the cracks. We're hearing more than ever that people are dying of addiction. And I absolutely don't think that that's necessary. I think if we had a more seamless program, if we had a more seamless line of support, we wouldn't see so many people fall through the cracks. So I made it my goal to be that seamless line to help people through. So one point of real contention to me is this whole concept of a one-size-fits-all for recovery. That drives me nuts, right? So there is no one-size-fits-all. How could there be? We're unique individuals with unique experiences, with unique abilities to access different solutions. We have different understandings, different psychologies, different intellects. How could there be one solution for such a variety of people? It just makes no sense to me. And probably the biggest point of contention for me is when people come into specific programs or whatever, and we give them this one-size-fits-all solution, and then we blame them when it doesn't work. Because we simply don't do that in any other therapy. Right? You don't go into Tracy's office and see her and say, I have this problem, and then have her try a medication or try a pathway to recovery for you, and then you go back a couple weeks later and you say, I still have this problem. Tracy doesn't blame you for that, right? She adjusts the program. And why we think when it comes to mental health and addictions that it should be any different, really, truly boggles my mind. And I honestly think that when we do that, we undermine people's success rather than help it. We hinder growth rather than foster it. Anyway, so I'm not actually here to lecture you all on that. I'm here to tell you a story. And I'm here to tell you about Sarah, because she's the prime example of what happens when we choose to approach recovery in this way. Now, Sarah is a mother of 2 very high energy and special needs children. She works and she's beautiful inside and out. And when I met her, she was a using addict. And she had been referred to me by her partner, who was, I guess by all appearances, the doting and codependent husband. By the time I met Sarah, she had been trying for 7 years unsuccessfully to get clean and sober, to get and stay clean and sober. She had attended counseling and outpatient programs, and then she upgraded to a 60-day in-house treatment facility, plus aftercare, that cost over $45,000. She attended 12-step meetings, she sought counsel, and she had done many, many hours of personal work that was assigned to her. And despite all of these efforts, she continued to relapse. And I was brought in as a sort of last-ditch effort, which really bugs me. Just that idea at all, it really bugs me. Anyways, but out of concern for her, really, I just said, okay, I made no promises, but I said, okay, I'll do everything I can to help you. If you're willing to fight, were my words, if you're willing to fight for yourself, then I'm willing to fight for you. And so I agreed to help, and I agreed to do that free of charge because I'm used to volunteering, and I'm getting better at, I'm hoping to get better at less volunteer and more career. But at this point, that's what I'm still doing it. Anyways, so as it turned out, I was asked to come in by this said partner to get her and her behaviors like under control, were the words. And you know what? As it turned out, under control was like a huge part of Sarah's life already. Within the first 6 months of working with Sarah, I understood that she was trying to stay clean while experiencing constant shame and blame. And not only that, she was under constant monitoring. Her family really didn't understand what was happening for her. So what they did was they isolated her. They took complete control over her finances, and they spoke down to her on a regular basis. I would ask if she was attending meetings, and she would say, "My husband said I have to stay home with the children," which meant that she would spend full days, sometimes full weeks, under a great deal of stress, in full isolation, without even the ability to reach out and call for help. It was pretty clear that the personal setup for Sarah's recovery wasn't one for success. And when she relapsed, the other people in her life truly did just hop on the bandwagon and blame her. They judged her outwardly, and really all that did was increase her own personal level of discomfort and made it more necessary, really, for her to use. So occasionally I would receive calls from the husband complaining about some behavior or relapse, and in those calls, he would call her useless. Now, I really don't like that word. And so I was very quick to correct him. You know, I've met a lot of addicts over the years, a lot, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of addicted people. And I've not yet met one that is totally useless. Generally, the addicted people that I have met are under a great deal of pain, and they're seeking some comfort in light of that pain. Often, that is related to untreated trauma and other issues. Still, each time Sarah failed, she was blamed for her lack of success and commitment, not only by her family, though, but by her sponsors, even the people at the treatment center who claimed that she wasn't dedicated enough, honest enough, or following their programs correctly. I gotta say, after this many years in recovery and this many years working with people in recovery, as shame and blame, they're just contrary to success. And really, it's like the fertilizer for addiction. And so if you've got someone in your life, and generally we all do, like there's a lot of people struggling with addiction and eating disorders and all that sort of stuff, and you're shaming them and blaming them, just try your best to just understand that at the core of these behaviors is often shame and blame. And so when we do that to one another, we're really just pouring fertilizer on the problem. So better we decide to strengthen one another. Anyway, so I really sort of wanted to scream. I know that this is contrary to recovery. And I wanted to say to them, like, you're undermining her success, you know? And those who know me know that I'm a real kind of, I would say mama bear now, right? But I've always been this way before I was a mother, and so I'd say I'm more of a rescuer. I'm the kind of person who runs into a fight, which is bonkers, but it's who I am. Anyway, so it's really just, I wanted to say those things. I wanted to tell her that under those circumstances, she was unlikely to succeed. But that's not my job, right? It's not my job to judge. And it's not my job to define anybody else's truth. And it's not, my job is to ask the sort of questions that help people find their own truth and then act towards their own highest good. A highest good, it's never my job to define. So despite the efforts to help Sarah under these circumstances, the day came when I got a call from her husband. "She's using," he said. "I know it. And honestly, I did too. She had told me herself that she was using." He finished that up with another, "She's useless and she has to go." So in response, I arranged with he and Sarah to have what we called a team meeting. But truly, it was more of a planned intervention. And so we sat down, and by the end of that meeting, we had arranged for a strategy that involved Sarah going away to detox from the methamphetamines she had been using, and come stay with me for in-house coaching once she returned. And this is where her recovery really began. At first, she was scared and weary in my presence. She seemed to be like walking on eggshells around my home. And I had the intuitive urge to just say to her, "Listen, if something comes up, we're going to talk about that honestly and with kindness and respect. So you don't have to be afraid that I'm going to get angry with you or, be bottling something up and then get abusive with you later. That's not going to happen." And it was interesting because you have these intuitive things and you don't really honestly know whether that's the issue or not the issue until someone like Sarah says, "Oh, thank God, I was so afraid." "I'm sorry, Sarah really matters to me. And that she is walking around ever afraid really bothers me." We stayed a few more days in peace, and we just sort of sat. And we saw it on the screen earlier, what it means to hold space. And that's what we did. We held space. I sat with her in the excruciating situation she was in, with the definite belief that within her was the power and the understanding of what it was that she needed and how she could overcome that. And you know what? Just in that holding of safe space, Sarah began to feel more and more comfortable. And conversations began, and answers to questions started to flow with more ease. And within 1 week of staying in my home, she began to open up about her husband. And she said to me in her first statement, "He's not very kind to me." And I said, "Oh, okay." And then she said, "I tried to talk about it in the treatment center. And when I told my counselor at the treatment center, she just told me that my husband loves me. And I wouldn't be here in the treatment center or even alive if it hadn't been for him." And so what that did when that counselor defined her truth was just shut her down completely. And at that point, she stopped talking about it at all. And she's from a small community, so the idea that she's going to go out into her community then and find someone safe to talk to is absolutely ridiculous. And it just didn't happen. So what I did was I assured her immediately, "Listen, if there is something going on for you, I want to hear about it. I care. And I won't be defining your truth anytime soon." I also assured her that outside of my obligation to report when someone's going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, that everything she said to me would be held in utmost confidence. And there's been a lot of Brene Brown drops here, but one of the most important things about trust is keeping things in the vault, she says, And knowing that you can say something to someone and it's going to be held sacred and within confidence is so important. And it's so important in situations like this, right? It's life engaging and life threatening in situations like this, not to hold it in the vault. So just as a general public, if somebody comes to you and starts to have a conversation like this, please do two things. Listen. 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 And hold it in the vault. Don't tell anyone else. Encourage them. They need your strength. Okay, so what happened was that within a few more conversations, she started to talk about what was actually happening in her home. And not only was she being isolated, not only was she being controlled, not only was she not having any access to finances, she was also being psychologically, physically, and sexually abused on an almost everyday level. And so when that's happening, it becomes very, very hard to even think about recovery. What you're thinking about is survival. And sometimes in situations like that, you do need an escape to survive. And when she told me these things, and then she said, and I just can't stay clean, I couldn't help but empathize. I had, at the time we met, I had over 20 years sober. And honestly, in thinking about it and knowing what was going on in their situation, I think I might have gone back using to live in that situation. So no wonder she wasn't staying clean. But she was in my home, right? And so she was safe. And so what we have in moments like that are a responsibility. And now I had a responsibility and Sarah had a responsibility. Now there's a big difference between responsibility and fault. And now and so fault is like when you've made a real mistake and I need to own this and I need to make it better, right? And responsibility isn't the exact same thing as that. So I love it. So Gabor Mate did a presentation and he described responsibility perfectly. He divided it into two words, response, ability. It's the ability to respond. And in my situation, I had a ton of things happen to me. I was sexually abused as a child, I was physically abused as a child, I was psychologically abused as a child, and none of that was my fault. And none of the things that were happening to Sarah were her fault either. But in the situation I was in, with need to recover, with need to rise above my own circumstances, I did have the ability and need to respond, as did Sarah in that moment. And so what we did was we came up with an action plan of what to do now and what to do for recovery. And so we started to work out that plan together as she came alive to her own understanding and her own truth. And so what that included, what that recovery plan needed to include, was a safe place to live and a safe place to be in the world. And so that's when we started reaching out to outside agencies. And it was me who went into the Transition Society first. I was new here, and so I spent a lot of time in North Vancouver. I did a lot of my outreach stuff in North Vancouver, and I know the programs. People from North Vancouver still call me and say, what do I do with this? Who do I send this to? Where is this? And I got the agencies, Here I had to go in and do the research. And when I walked into the Transition Society and they told me what they do and what they have to offer, I was very quick to bring that back to Sarah. And Sarah looked at it too, and Sarah made the decision for herself that it was well worth her time to go in and speak to the ladies at the Transition Society. So what they did for her was immediately start to help her with EI applications. They started helping her get domestic abuse counsel. They took her into a room full of toys because she was, one of the things that was paining her, like giving her so much pain, was the fact that her son's birthday was coming up. And she had zero funds, zero money to get him a birthday gift. And so they took her into a room of toys, and a room of toys that was contributed by this phenomenal community, by the way, right? These were donated toys. And she got to select what she wanted for her son. Now that's a beautiful thing. Now, not only did they do that, they immediately put her on the waiting list for Lily House. And within a day of leaving my house, she got into safe housing. And she stayed there for just under 2 months. And in there, she was given in-house counseling. She had access to therapy dogs or therapy animals. And she was helped to facilitate safe visits with her sons. And anyone in here, now the stats are pretty high. We checked them out. They're still at 2/3 of women. So I'm well aware that as I tell this story, 2/3 of the women in this room can relate on some level. And so I know that I can. I've stayed in homeless shelters myself as a teenager, but I also, my daughter's in the audience now, and when she was under 1, we spent time in the domestic abuse shelter as well. She doesn't remember that, but that's a part of our journey, and that's just the way it is. Anyway, so upon leaving that facility, she was able to access affordable, subsidized housing, which they also helped her with. And she has been clean, sober, and working, and back to her beautiful self since the moment she left that house. And for this, I am very, very grateful. Now, as I said, how are we doing for time? So as I said, there's a reason that I understand Sarah's situation. There's a reason that I could see that so clearly. There's a reason that Sarah and I are like kindred spirits, right? Because I myself have experienced domestic violence, but not only is that the case, I am from a long line of women who have experienced domestic violence. So and addiction, and trauma. So my grandmother, who was a Métis woman, experienced devastating domestic violence. She actually died at my age of alcoholism because she was unable to cope with that situation. My mother also had a very similar situation, which set me up for the same trauma. But what did she know any different? And then I grew up, and as I said, my daughter had to come with me into a domestic violence shelter. Now, what that's done for me, as I said, I've always been a fighter. I remember when I had the breakdown, the PTSD breakdown, my poor mom was there. She was watching me shake. And she said, "Autumn, you're scaring me. You've always been the strong one." And that's been the truth. That's been the truth of it. But even as the strong ones, we get weak sometimes. And so part of my strong mission has been to source out my own vulnerabilities to domestic violence and to these sort of abusive situations, because it is the only thing I have power over. It's my only ability to respond, if that makes any sense. I'm not going to change any abuser at this point in time. Like, we have laws, we have police, we have all sorts of people to hold these people accountable. I'm not that person. What I can do is I can do things like this. I can help to strengthen other women, and I can search within my own self to find the vulnerabilities that set me up for this kind of relating. And so I did that. And so what I've understand is what I've come to understand after many, many years of lots and lots of study, lots and lots of research, lots and lots of staying with myself and staying in the room with my own experiences, even in the midst of very uncomfortable and sometimes abusive situations. So that's meant, like, how the frick did I get into this situation again? Okay, here I am. Stay with myself, even with this. Right, we were talking about, some of the speakers said, you need to love yourself even with this. You know, it's embarrassing to be a fighter, to be considered the strong one, to be the mentor, to be the doctor, to be the therapist, and find yourself in these situations. But it happens to all of us. And so to stay with ourselves and to stay in our own realities, it really does help to strengthen. So that's what I've done. And what I've recognized is some of vulnerabilities within myself. And so here are some of those. So what I've realized is that that there's some attachment issues for me. And attachment issues happen unconsciously. It's like there's something seemingly programmed into my attachment system that happens without my conscious awareness or permission, and leaves me vulnerable to re-victimization. It's like I've learned, it's not like I've learned, what happened is growing up, I learned some very real coping mechanisms, and my attachment system was formed under being exposed to someone who had a very dangerous psychological state. And so I learned these sort of steps in this dance that really, what I did for survival as a child was to buffer my abuser from his own dangerous psychology and override my own reality. And so what I've done in adulthood is carried this through as an unconscious programming. And what I've done is I've attracted the sort of people who need what? Buffering from their own dangerous psychological states, and someone who's willing to override their own reality in favor for theirs. And so when I discover that I'm doing this part of that dance, I can choose to change the dance steps. But before I understand that that's a part of my patterning, I can't change it. And in order to understand that, I had to be willing not only to have other people hold sacred space for me, but to hold sacred space for myself. Also, another thing that keeps me vulnerable, or that has made me vulnerable to these things in the past, is mistaking empathy for love. I'm not sure if anybody else in here has ever done that, but it's a big factor for me. Now, empathy is that thing that happens when we really want to help someone else, when we feel what they feel and we really want to help them. And essentially, empathy is a really beautiful thing. It's what helps us work together. It's what helps us with our friendships and all of that, right? It's great. Now, empathy for me becomes a problem when I'm so busy empathizing and helping that I don't notice that someone is hurting me, that I don't even register that that's the case. And that's where empathy gets me into trouble. Or even more so, that I want to help so much that I'm willing to take blame and responsibility. When they say, oh, it's your fault I'm behaving this way, and I'm willing to take that on, that's when empathy gets me in trouble. But let's think about that, because in 20 years, I've worked with a lot of women who have said things like, you know, I was raped, but really it's my fault. I shouldn't have been there. Think about that. Whose hands do I have control over? Whose body do I have control over? Can I ever force you, Julia, to hurt me? No. And it doesn't work the other way either, right? And I've had to ask those questions, right? Whose body do you have control over? Whose hands do you have control over? Whose words do you have control over? And it makes a big difference. And so that's where empathy gets me in trouble. Now, the other thing that happens to me is that growing up, I needed to learn some different things about trust. And what I was told to do was to trust someone who was hurting me. And so I learned to assume trust rather than learn trust or know trust. Now, there's a huge difference between assume trust and learn trust. Learn trust happens over a length of time. It happens when someone consistently shows up for me, is consistently loving and kind, and is actually there when I need them. And that it happens the other way when I do those things for other people, right? It's like in my relationship with Sue. Sue and I have been wonderful friends. And we don't agree all the time. And she's not always able to hold space for me, and I'm not always able to hold space for her. But even in those moments, we are kind and loving to one another, and it's consistent. Right? Now, the other thing that comes up is there's intermittent reinforcement. How many people here have heard of intermittent reinforcement? 1, 2, yeah, not enough. So what intermittent reinforcement is where basically you're going along your life, right? And you've got a bunch of sort of bullshit treatment, right? You've got hurtful treatment, you've got cut downs, you've got all this stuff, and then you get love bombed. Boom. I love you so much, baby. Here, have these flowers. This is awesome, right? And it's just enough. It's just enough to have you buy in one more time. Now, what's the opposite of intermittent reinforcement? Consistent reinforcement. Consistently being there for one another. Right? Consistent reinforcement. Now, what happens in that intermittent reinforcement is it does this thing that I call psychological bondage. Right? I call it psychological bondage because that's what it feels like to me. It feels like my brain is it's entrapped in this weird situation where I am anxious all the time. And why am I anxious? I'm anxious because I'm waiting for the other foot to drop all the time. I'm waiting for that other foot to drop. And some people call this trauma bonding. But what happens in that trauma bond, what happens in that psychological bondage, is that we're in this relationship and we get in this state of cognitive dissonance, which is sort of this, I'm always confused. I can't figure out which way is up. Do they love me? Do they not love me? They say they love me, but they're treating me this way. And women get really obsessed almost. It's like it just spins the wheels round and round and round. Because I don't know about you, but when my brain can't make sense of something, it won't let it go. And relationships, the abusive relationships that I've been in, they don't make any damn sense. And so what I find myself doing is going back to the very person who's causing the discomfort to seek comfort, to seek that love bond, to seek that attachment, to seek that thing. And it boggles the mind of the people who are outside of this watching, right? They're like, why does she keep going back to that person? Can't she see they're hurting her? And the truth is, in those situations, when I'm in a trauma bond, when I'm in a psychological bondage like that, I can't see it. Because the anxiety, the fight or flight mind, it's not your conscious mind. It's not able to think through those details. Thank you. I'm not done. I was talking to Julia. She's giving me the 1 minute. I'm not done. I'll be done soon, but I'm not done yet. I think there's a few more things we need to look at. So the other thing that happens, so there's that psychological bondage. There's that thing that happens where we get all messed up in our head and we seem to be chasing after the abuser. But the other thing that happens is that we get a social pressure too. So we get this sort of, that's the thing that Sarah ran into at the treatment center. That's the thing that I ran into when I was raising 2 daughters and I was being called useless, bitch, whore, all those things, right? And still told, you can't leave your husband. You can't do that. What about your kids? Right? Same thing that Sarah's therapist did to her. So this idea of social pressure, it's not helpful. And the last thing that happens for me, having grown up in this sort of abusive situation, is something called dissociation. Who knows what dissociation is? Oh, great, that's a lot more of you. So dissociation is where you're here, but you're sort of comprehending your life from just outside of your body. So you're not fully even aware of what's happening. And in that dissociation, I found myself agreeing to things that were ridiculous to agree to. Anyways. So what I've understood is that in all of that happens, those vulnerabilities, they happen for many of us. And Sarah and I sat down and we looked at those vulnerabilities. And we looked at, not only do we look at those vulnerabilities and say, which of these apply? Does this apply for you or doesn't it? And in every single one of those things, she said, yes, it does apply. Absolutely, it applies. And thank you, Julia, thank you. So it absolutely applies. And so we also looked at things like, are you being gaslit? So who in here knows what gaslighting means? Great, great. So for those of you who don't, gaslighting is that thing that happens when you're asked to override your own reality in favor for someone else's. And it's really a psychologically undermining thing because your truth is no longer your truth. And when you surrender that, then it leaves you really, really powerless. So anyways, we looked at all of that. We looked at, are you being gaslit? Are you being abused? Do these things fit for you? Don't they fit for you? And what we found was a lot of these things fit. And a lot of these things fit universally. And so they're really good things to watch out for. They're really good things to look to, and they're really good things to hire, a coach or a therapist. If you're in any of these situations, or you have a friend or relative who is going through this sort of thing, it's really good to look at these things. Anyway, so one of my jobs as a recovery coach is to really just look at not only what's happening, not only hold that space and face the excruciating reality and believe in people being able to source their own solutions and overcome, but my job is to strength spot and value mine. And now let us take a second to take a look at that when it comes to Sarah. Now, here was a woman using so much that she described herself as near death, and from all outside appearances, was a woman choosing to fail her family. But as we know, the reality instead was a woman striving, trying, and continuing to persevere under excruciating circumstances. A mother of two, trying everything she could to get the help she needed, despite the psychological, physical, and sexual abuse she was experiencing every day. Now, to me, that screams honest, it screams willing, it screams perseverant, it screams strong, it screams loving and full of dedication. She was never useless, nor will she ever be. She's beautiful inside and out. And she's in this room. And so if you wouldn't mind just giving her a round of applause, I would appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah. You really are an inspiration, and you are loved. Also, I truly believe that without the help of the Transition Society and the resources they connected us with, that Sarah might not have been such a huge success, and my work with Sarah wouldn't have been a huge success. Because when we sourced out those needs, had we not been able to meet them, Sarah might not be here. But the Transition Society set us up so that we could meet them. And so if you wouldn't mind, please also giving the Transition Society a round of applause. To all of you, really, when you came here today, you chose to help fund the kind of projects that keep people like Sarah alive, and to make not only these women, but their children more safe in the world. So just a quick stat before we let go. On average, Lily House sees over 300 women and children every single year. And the Transition Society itself receives on average 1,500 crisis calls a year. That's what they're fielding. And when you guys showed up here today, you made a choice to support those efforts. And so thank you, and if we could have a round of applause for you too. And now, 3 minutes under 5, I will be quiet.